They followed a corridor to an elevator that whisked them downward with no sensation of motion whatsoever, and then walked out into a large, elaborately furnished room. It was dimly lit. Bander pointed its finger, and where it pointed the light grew more intense. It pointed it elsewhere, and the same thing happened. "How large is this home of yours?" Pellerat asked Bander. It must have been the right question, for Bander beamed. "Very large. One of the largest on the planet, I believe. It goes on for kilometers in every direction. I have as many robots caring for my home underground as I have in all the thousands of square miles of surface." "You don't live in all of it, surely?" "It might conceivably be that there are chambers I have never entered, but what of that?" said Bander. "The robots keep every room clean, well ventilated, and in order. But come, step out here." They passed through a door into another corridor, where Bander now motioned them into a little topless ground car that carried them along tracks past an apparently endless series of rooms. And wherever they went there were robots by the scores, engaged in unhurried work whose nature none of the passengers could easily divine. They passed the open door of one large room in which rows of robots were bent quietly over desks. Pellerat asked, "What are they doing, Bander?" "Bookkeeping," Bander replied. "I control their work." "How do you control all of this?" Bander lifted the hair on either side of its head, exposing behind each ear a bulge the size and shape of the blunt end of a hen's egg. "Transducer lobes," Bander said. "They are activated by the flow of heat, and they convert the heat flow into mechanical energy. The transducers are what make it possible for us Solarians to run this world of ours. Every robot on this vast estate obtains its energy from me, or rather from natural heat flow. Whether the robot is adjusting a contact or felling a tree, the energy is derived from my mental transduction. It's a process that continues waking or sleeping." The car came to a halt, and Bander said, "I have enjoyed speaking to all of you, and observing you in all your strangeness. It was a unique experience. But now, little half-humans, I'm afraid the time has come when I must do what my ancestors would have done at once. I must kill you, for talking to you has been shamiferous. At least that's the Solarian word for it. I don't know your galactic equivalent. No, Trevize, do not bother reaching for your weapons." Trevize, not knowing what Bliss would or could do, struggled to fight an overwhelming sense of loss, not so much at the thought of dying, as of dying without knowing where Earth was, without knowing why he had chosen Gaia as humanity's future. He had to play for time. He strove to keep his voice steady. "You have shown yourself a courteous and gentle Solarian, Bander. It would suit your character better to allow us to leave." "You are wrong. I have merely pampered my curiosity, but I can do it no longer, for I have compromised the safety of Solaria. If, through some weakness, I were persuaded to let you go, others of your kind would surely follow, however much you might promise otherwise." Trevize said despairingly, "I ask you, as an act of mercy, not to do this." Bander suddenly turned grim. "I must first be merciful to myself and to my world, and to do that, you must die." He raised his hand, and instantly darkness descended upon Trevize. For a moment, Trevize felt the darkness choking him, and thought wildly, "Is this death?" As though his thoughts had given rise to an echo, he heard, "Is this death?" It was Pellerat. "The mere fact you can ask shows it is not death," Trevize replied, with a sense of relief. "There are old legends that there is life after death." "Nonsense," muttered Trevize. "Bliss? Are you here, Bliss?" "Bliss? Bliss?" Pellerat echoed. When the lights came back on, they both saw Bander crumpled in a heap, with Bliss at its side, holding its head. The robots were silent and frozen. "The Solarian is dead," she said, her cheeks glistening with tears in the dim light. Trevize was dumbfounded. "Why are you crying?" "Should I not cry at having killed a living thing of thought and intelligence? My intention was only to send it into a normal sleep, prolonged enough for us to get out of this mansion and into our ship. But Bander was on the point of killing us. That was cause for stopping it, not killing it." Pellerat helped her to her feet. "Please, Bliss, even you can't bring it back to life. Tell us what happened." "Gaia can do what Bander could do. Gaia can make use of the unevenly distributed energy of the universe and translate it into chosen work by mental power alone. I blocked the exit of the energy in its transducer lobes, and the energy piled up within the lobes and killed it." Trevize hesitated. He was loath to upset Bliss further, since she was, after all, their only defense against a supremely hostile world. "Bliss," he said after a while, "it is time to look beyond Bander's death. It is important that we get back to the surface and to our ship without delay." "But, Golan," said Pellerat, "how do we do that? I imagine it's quite a maze down here, and for myself I haven't the faintest idea which direction to go in." Pellerat was right, Trevize realized. "We'll just have to search for an opening." "Wait," said Bliss. "I sense something." "What?" said Trevize. "A mind. Intelligence. What reaches me most clearly, though, is something else. Fright. Intolerable fright." Bliss led the way, pausing at each doorway, at each fork in the corridor, trying to sense the direction from which the fright came. As she had some small control over the light, it came on ahead of her, but it was always strongest in her immediate neighborhood. At last they walked into a large room that, unlike the others they had seen, was rich and colorful in furnishings. In the center of the room was a robot, stooping slightly, its arms stretched out in what seemed an almost affectionate gesture, and, of course, it was absolutely motionless. From behind the robot, a round, frightened eye peeped out, and then there was the sound of broken-hearted sobbing. Trevize darted around the robot, and from the other side a small figure shot out, shrieking. It stumbled, fell to the ground, and lay there, kicking its legs, as though to ward off some threat. Bliss said, quite unnecessarily, "It's a child." Trevize drew back, puzzled. What was a child doing here? Bander had been so proud of its absolute solitude, so insistent upon it. Pellerat, by contrast, seized upon the solution at once. "I suppose this is the successor, Bander's child." Bliss was gazing at the child in a soft, mesmerizing way, and slowly its outcry was reduced to an occasional soft whimper. She then began to make sounds of her own, soothing ones, broken words that made little sense in themselves, but were meant to reinforce the calming effect of her thoughts. "There, child. Warm, child. Safe. Safe. Safe." She stopped, and without looking around said in a low voice, "Pell, speak to it in its language. Tell it we're new robots come to take care of it." "Robots?" Pellerat was shocked. "We must be presented as robots. It's not afraid of robots, and it's never seen human beings. Maybe it can't even conceive of them." Pellerat did the best he could. Then he reported, "I think it's asking what made Jemby stop. Jemby must be the robot." "Check and make sure, Pell." Pellerat spoke to the child again. then listened, and said, "Yes, Gemby is the robot. The child calls itself Phallum." "Good." Bliss smiled luminously at the child, pointed to it, and said, "Phallum. Good, Phallum. Brave Phallum." She placed a hand on her chest and said, "Bliss." She touched the child's shoulder, and then looked behind its ears. "The transducer lobes are still small, which means that at the present time it can't control the estate or even activate its own personal robot." There followed the longest conversation Pellerat had yet had with Phallum. Finally he said, "I told Phallum that if it could get us out to the surface, that might make it possible for us to activate the robot. Do you suppose we might?" Trevize said, "We'll worry about that later. Did it say it would guide us?" "Yes." Bliss took Phallum by the hand, and the child skipped out through the door, turning without pause whenever there was a choice of paths. Did it really know where it was going? At last the child broke away from Bliss and ran. A door opened in front of it, and an elevator, powered with some difficulty by Bliss, carried them all up into luminous twilight. The leaving was a blur. They had run like possessed people. Trevize had opened the airlock in a frenzy, and they had all tumbled in. Now, Pellerat came out of the room he shared with Bliss. "The child is sleeping normally now. We didn't get back on the ship a moment too soon for me. Or for any of us. But why did we bring that child on board?" Pellerat shrugged. "Bliss wouldn't let go. She can't bear—" "I know," said Trevize. Pellerat said, "It's a very oddly shaped child." "Being hermaphroditic, it would have to be," said Trevize. "It has testicles, you know, and what I can only describe as a very small vagina." Trevize made a face. "Disgusting." "Not really, Golan. It's adapted to its needs. It only delivers a fertilized egg cell or very tiny embryo, which is then developed under laboratory conditions, tended, I dare say, by robots." "And what happens if their robot system breaks down? If that happens, they would no longer be able to produce viable young." "Any world would be in trouble if its social structure broke down completely." "Not," said Trevize, "that I would weep uncontrollably over the Solarians." "Well," his friend said, "I admit it doesn't seem a very attractive world, to us, I mean. But that's only the people and social structure, which are not our type at all, dear chap. But subtract the people and the robots, and you have a world which otherwise might fall apart as Aurora is beginning to," Trevize finished for him. "How's Bliss, Janov?" "Worn out, I'm afraid. She's sleeping now. She had a very bad time, Golan. I didn't exactly enjoy myself, either." "What are we going to do next, Golan?" "Just as soon as I get a little sleep, I'm going to get the computer to plot our course to that third world." Trevize slept considerably longer than he had expected to, but that scarcely mattered. There was neither day nor night in any natural sense on board ship, and the circadian rhythm worked imperfectly. In the course of his shower, Trevize even speculated about sleeping longer. It was then that he turned and found himself staring at Phallum, who was as undressed as he was. Trevize could not help jumping back. Then Phallum said in its high-pitched voice, "Greetings. Bliss say you wash me." Trevize started slightly at the child's unexpected use of galactic. "Yes? You stay here." Trevize stepped out of the shower and dressed hurriedly, roaring, "Bliss!" It was difficult for anyone to be more than 4 meters from anyone else on the ship, and Bliss came to the door at once. She said, smiling, "Are you calling me, Trevize, or was that the soft breeze sighing through the waving grass?" "Let's not be funny, Bliss. What is that?" He jerked his thumb over his shoulder. Bliss looked past him and said, "Well, it looks like the young Solarian we brought on board yesterday. you brought on board. Why do you want me to wash it? You should wash it." Bliss shrugged. "I will, if you insist. But I would want it to feel friendly with each of us. It would be useful to have each of us perform parental functions. Surely you can cooperate in that?" "Not to this extent. And when you're done, put it in your room. Sit it down in a corner. I want to talk to you." "I'll be at your service." He nursed his wrath for a moment, then moved into the pilot room and activated the view screen. And, as often on such occasions, he fell to studying the stars, almost hypnotic in their quiet changelessness. All their turbulence and instability were wiped out by the distance that left them only dots of light. One of those dots, he knew, might well be the sun about which Earth revolved, the original sun, under whose radiation life began, and under whose beneficence humanity evolved. But what was he looking for, anyway? Was it Earth, or was it the flaw in Selden's plan that he thought for no clear reason he might find on Earth? For Galaxia, a member of an entirely different species of organization, to be better than the Second Galactic Empire, there must be a flaw in the plan, something the great Harry Selden had himself overlooked. But if it were something Selden had overlooked, how could Trevize correct the matter? Was he himself, Trevize wondered, truly the man with flawless intuition, as Gaia insisted? Was this all madness, this quest for Earth? An overwhelming weight of shame came over him and seemed to squeeze the breath out of him. He looked at the stars, remote, uncaring, and thought, "I must be the great fool of the galaxy." Bliss's voice broke in on him. "Well, Trevize, why do you want to see? Is anything wrong?" Trevize looked up and for a moment found it difficult to brush away his mood. He stared at her, then said, No, nothing's wrong." She seemed to accept his statement. "Pellerat is with Fallum, teaching it galactic phrases. What do you want to see me about?" "I wanted to discuss with you your reasons for bringing Fallum aboard." "This offers Gaia an opportunity to study a kind of brain that it has never before studied, Trevize." "You see the child as an important bit of fundamental brain research." "In a way, yes." "That is not the way I feel. To me, it seems we have taken danger aboard. Great danger." "How do you know this?" "I feel it, Bliss, without reason. And it is you, not I, who insist my intuition is infallible." Bliss frowned and looked uneasy. Trevize felt depressed. What few victories he had had since the search began had never been definitive. They had merely been the staving off of defeat. Now he had delayed the jump to the third of the spacer worlds till he had spread his unease to the others. When he finally decided that he simply must tell the computer to move the ship through hyperspace, Pellerat was standing solemnly in the pilot room doorway, and Bliss was standing just behind him with Fallum. He instructed the computer to jump in such a way as to re-enter space at a further distance from the star in question than was absolutely necessary. He told himself that that was because he was learning caution as a result of the events on the first two spacer worlds. But well underneath, he knew he was just buying himself a few more days of in-space travel before he would perhaps have to stare bitter defeat in the face. The star pattern on the view screen shifted, and there, nearly in the center, was a brightly gleaming star. He glanced toward his companions and said, "That's it." Several days later, Trevize had located a habitable planet of the right size and the right distance from the star. However, as they closed in on the one-time spacer planet, the spacecraft's sensors registered no atmosphere. Trevize was silent and grave. "What are we doing?" Pellerat at last brought himself to ask. "We're going to it," Trevize answered solemnly. "But since there's no atmosphere—" "The computer says there's no atmosphere. Till now it's always told me what I've wanted to hear, and I've accepted it. Now it has told me something I don't want to hear, and I'm going to check it. If the computer is ever going to be wrong, this is the time I want it to be wrong." Pellerat fell silent, but did not leave, and after a while Trevize whispered, "There's a haze." "Then there must be an atmosphere," Pellerat blurted out. "Not necessarily much of one. Enough to support a thin wind that will raise dust, I suppose, but not to support life." He fell silent again for a long time while he examined the radar mapping on the view screen. Then his face broke into a grin, and he said, "Well, there are no craters." "No craters. Is that good?" "It's very good. You see, planets form through the smashing together of smaller objects. The last few objects to collide leave crater marks, potentially, that is. The wind and flowing water of habitable worlds will erode craters, and if there is life, the actions of living things are strongly erosive as well. See? This planet must have had an ocean, an atmosphere, and life in the past." Pellerat looked doubtful. "I may not be a planetologist, but it seems to me that if a planet has a dense atmosphere for perhaps billions of years, it isn't going to suddenly lose it, is it?" Trevize shrugged. "There may have been a catastrophe, or there may have been some strange imbalance that human beings controlled as long as they were here, but that went into a vicious cycle of atmospheric reduction once they were gone. Even from here I've spotted the remains of what I'm sure was a city. We land tomorrow." A little later Bliss entered the pilot room, looking worried. "Phalum is convinced we're going to take it back to Gembi, its robot. It thinks we've come back to Solaria." Trevize looked up from his view screen with irritation on his face. "Please, I can't stand this it business. Can't we just refer to Phalum as a she arbitrarily? She has the high-pitched voice of a girl, after all. Now tell me, does she think this planet looks like Solaria?" "How would she know?" "Well, tell her it's not Solaria. Look, I'll give you some reference book films. Show her close-ups of a number of different inhabited worlds and explain that there are millions of them. You'll have time for it while Janoff and I wander around the surface." It was dawn, and the sky was clear when Trevize and Pellerat in bloated spacesuits stepped through the airlock and onto the soil of the dead world. They approached a building, and Trevize pointed toward a wall. His radioed voice sounded clearly in Pellerat's ear. "The buildings don't look as good down here as they did from the sky. They're cracked and crumbling. That's the result of the temperature changes that occur here in this thin atmosphere. You see how the frost that formed overnight is already melting?" Pellerat pointed. "There are letters engraved in the stone above that entrance, but they're difficult to read. It seems to have been a financial institution of some sort. At least I can make out a word which may be bank." They moved about with increasing haste, spending less time at each building. Pellerat said, "Look over there. That building seems to be called the Hall of the Worlds." They entered a high hall, in the center of which was a larger-than-life-size synthetic stone human figure. One arm had fallen off. The other arm was cracked at the shoulder, and Trevize felt that if he tapped it sharply, it, too, would fall. Pellerat was looking up at markings on the wall. "Amazing. 20,000 years old, perhaps, and in here, protected from the sun and damp, they're still legible." "Not to me," said Trevize. "It's an old script. Let's see now. There are 50 names listed, and this is the Hall of the Worlds. I assume those are the names of the 50 spacer worlds, probably in the order of their establishment. Aurora is the first, and Solaria is last." "And which one is this planet we're standing on? Can you tell?" Pellerat said, "You'll notice that the fifth—" one down in the third column is inscribed in larger letters than the others. It says Melpomene. It's a name I'm unfamiliar with. Could it represent Earth? Pellerat shook his head vigorously. There are dozens of words used for Earth in the old legends. Gaia is one of them, as you know. So is Terra and Erda, and so on. They're all short. I don't know of any long name used for it, or anything even resembling a short version of Melpomene. Then we're standing on Melpomene, and it's not Earth. Yes, Pellerat answered. Besides, the coordinates for Melpomene are given as 0, 0, 0. Coordinates, Trevize said, dumbfounded. That list gives coordinates? Well, it gives 3 figures for each, and I presume those are coordinates. What else can they be? Trevize opened a small compartment in his spacesuit and took out a camera that fed the image directly into the ship computer. After he had photographed the list, he said, The coordinates of the spacer worlds are interesting, all right, but what we really want are Earth's coordinates. If they're not here, they may be elsewhere in the building, or in another building. Come, Janov. No, wait, Pellerat began. No, said Trevize impatiently. He looked at the temperature reading on the back of his glove. We'll talk later. We've got to see what else this building can give us. It's getting warmer. Suddenly Trevize stared at Pellerat with a mixture of horror and revulsion. What's wrong with your faceplate? It was at once clear what was wrong with the faceplate. There was moss growing luxuriantly where the glass of the faceplate met the metallized fabric of the suit itself. The faceplate was rimmed with green fuzziness, and Trevize knew his own was too. He brushed a finger of his glove across Pellerat's faceplate, and some of the moss came off, staining the glove green. He tried again, and this time the moss crackled off. He brushed the edges of Pellerat's faceplate again, rubbing hard. Do mine, Janov, he said. Then later, do I look clean? Good. So do you. Let's go. The sun was uncomfortably hot now in the deserted, airless city, and the stone buildings gleamed brightly, almost achingly. It seemed a long walk back to the ship. Pellerat said, Look! Trevize saw. The boundaries of the ship's main lock were outlined in green moss. Carbon dioxide is the bottleneck, Trevize said. The spores of this moss must be everywhere, and wherever a few molecules of carbon dioxide are to be found, leaking out at the boundary of the faceplate, for example, the moss sprouts. He lowered his blaster's intensity to minimum so that it would function as a mild heat ray, and aimed at the main lock rim. Several centimeters of the moss-like growth browned at once. Then he sprayed the heat all around the main lock, and the green vanished, all of it. I think we can open it now. Trevize used his wrist controls and tapped out the combination that activated the opening mechanism from the inside. The lock gaped, and Trevize said, Don't dawdle, Janov. Get inside. By the not entirely satisfactory illumination of the lock light, Trevize turned his blaster on the inner meeting of lock and hull, and then he played the invisible beam over Pellerat's faceplate, then, little by little, over the rest of the spacesuit. He muttered, Lift your arms, Janov. Then, rest your arm on my shoulder and lift one foot. I've got to do the soles. Now the other. Are you getting too warm? Pellerat said, I'm not exactly bathed in cool breezes, Golan. Well then, give me a taste of my own medicine. Only when he had been heated everywhere and was covered with an uncomfortable perspiration did Trevize open the door into the spaceship and signal for Janov to take his suit off. Bliss met them at the door. What happened? What's been going on? We're guarding against infection, said Trevize, so I'll be turning on the ultraviolet radiation. Break out the dark glasses. Please, don't delay. With ultraviolet added to the wall illumination, Trevize took off his moist garments one by one and shook them out. What infection? Bliss asked. With a deliberate air of indifference, Trevize said, Just a little something that, given its own way, could do great damage to humanity, I think. They took the ship up into space, and Trevize maneuvered it as close as he could to Melpomene's sun, turning and twisting the vessel so as to drench its entire surface in ultraviolet. "All this," said Bliss at last, "for moss? Isn't that what you said it was, Trevize?" "Of course," Trevize answered. "If only a few spores remained alive, they would be enough to infest an entire world. Who knows what damage they might do?" Bliss shook her head. "Life is not necessarily dangerous because it is different. You are so ready to kill." "That's Gaia speaking." "Of course it is. But never mind. Being an isolate, you probably had no choice but to do what you did." "Was there Gemby there where you were?" Fallum broke in. "Come, Fallum," Pellerat gently placed an arm around the youngster's shoulder. "Come to our room and I'll get you another book to read." The door closed behind them, and Bliss said to Trevize, "Doesn't she speak galactic well, and in almost no time?" "You know," he answered impatiently, "we waste our time playing nursemaid to that child." "Waste? In what sense does it interfere with your search for Earth, Trevize? In no way. Playing nursemaid establishes communication, however, allays fear, supplies love. Are these achievements nothing?" "That's Gaia speaking again." "Yes. Let's be practical, then. We have visited 3 old spacer worlds, and we have gained nothing. In fact, we have found each one dangerous. Apparently, when a world is left to itself, whether it contains human beings or not, it becomes dangerous to the interstellar community." "You can't consider that a general rule." "Please listen to me. The only way the galaxy will work is as Galaxia, and the sooner the better. Just look what the alternatives are. Look at Celeria, whose hand is against all worlds, while on it the hand of each individual is against all others. You've seen it. And if human discipline disappears altogether in an isolate environment, the each against each becomes unreasoning, as with the dogs on Aurora, or is merely an elemental force, as with the moss on Melpomene. You see, the closer we are to Galaxia, the better the society. Why, then, stop at anything short of Galaxia?" Trevize stared silently at Bliss, then said, "I'm thinking about it. But why this assumption that dosage is a one-way thing, that if a little is good, a lot is better, and all there is best of all? I don't say the old galactic empire was ideal, and I can certainly see flaws in the Foundation Confederation. But I'm not prepared to say that because total isolation is bad, total unification is good. But there is no point in arguing. I will have my solution when I find Earth. On Melpomene, we found the coordinates of 47 other spacer worlds. If we have to, we'll visit every one of them." Pellerat emerged now from the bedroom where he had been sitting with Fallum and said softly, "But why, look, Golan, we have the answer." "What?" Trevize said blankly. "I said we have the answer. I tried to tell you this on Melpomene, but you were so wrapped up." "What answer do we have? What are you talking about?" "About Earth. I think we know where Earth is." Trevize stared at Pellerat for a long moment, and with an expression of displeasure. "Please listen to me," said Pellerat. "There was an early researcher named Humble Yarif who attempted to locate Earth on the assumption that planets would have been settled outward from it in radial symmetry, the oldest settlements being nearest to Earth and the most recent the farthest. He didn't succeed, of course, because the worlds he was extrapolating from were part of the second expansion of the human race. By the time of the second expansion, hyperspatial travel was far advanced, and leapfrogging very long distances was simple. Settlement no longer had to proceed outward in radial symmetry. But now, think for a moment, Golan, of the 50 spacer worlds. They were settled when hyperspatial travel was still in its infancy. There was probably little or no leapfrogging. Well, now, we have the coordinates of those 50 spacer worlds. Whoever is destroying information concerning Earth must have overlooked them. those coordinates taken together should exist in roughly spherical symmetry around the world of origin. Now, all you have to do is adjust the coordinates to allow for the last 20,000 years of stellar motions, then find the sphere's center. Trevize's mouth had fallen slightly open during the recital, and it took a few moments for him to close it after Pellerat was done. All he could think to say was, "Now why didn't I think of that?" Trevize, who was used to accepting miracles from the computer, found himself astonished at how little time the job took. The computer identified the star closest to the center of the sphere composed of the 50 worlds' coordinates. The galactic map lists the star as possessing a planet with human life, but with a question mark. Pellerat's enthusiasm grew. "That's exactly what we would expect, Golan. The life-bearing planet is there, but the attempt to hide the fact leaves the maker of the map uncertain." "It's the attempt that bothers me." Pellerat ignored the comment. "What other information about the star is given?" "A name." "Ah, what is it?" "Alpha." "Ah, Alpha is the first letter of the alphabet in the prehistoric language of Earth, the same one that gave us the word Gaia. That implies that it's the first sun. And wouldn't the first sun be the one around which a planet revolved that was the first to bear human life? Earth?" "Are you sure of that?" "Absolutely," said Pellerat. "Earth's star is a single sun, I suppose." "Well, of course. As far as I know, all inhabited worlds orbit single stars." "So I would have thought myself. The trouble is that the star in the center of the view screen is not a single star. It's a binary. A second star with a period of roughly 80 years circles the bright one. It's not Earth's sun. It can't be." He shrugged. "I didn't really expect to see Earth's sun centered among the 50 worlds. Even the spacers wouldn't settle worlds in such a way as to set up an exact sphere. Aurora, the oldest of the spacer worlds, might have sent out settlers of its own, and that may have distorted the sphere, too. Then, too, the Earth's sun may not have moved these last 20,000 years at precisely the velocity of the spacer worlds." Pellerat said, "So the Earth can be anywhere. Is that what you're saying?" "No, not quite anywhere. All these sources of error can't amount to much. Earth's sun must be in the vicinity of the coordinates, and the star we've spotted almost exactly at the coordinates must be a neighbor of it. I wasn't really expecting Earth's sun to be on the map anyway. The fact that Alpha is on the map made me suspect it almost immediately." Trevize looked at the view screen again. "That one there, to the left and upward from Alpha, about a parsec away in real space. That isn't in the computer's galactic map. That is Earth's sun, I'll wager. I'll wager all my fortune on it." "Well, now," said Bliss, "we won't take any part of your fortune if you lose, so why not just settle the matter? Let's visit the star as soon as you can make the jump." Trevize shook his head. "No, I'd rather approach cautiously. 3 times we've visited unknown worlds, and 3 times we've come up against something unexpectedly dangerous. Besides, we've heard so many stories about Earth's radioactivity. I think we ought to see what we can find out around that planet nearer to the binary first. If there are human beings there, they'll know something about Earth, because Earth for them isn't a distant thing of legend. It would be a neighbor world, bright and prominent in their sky." As they descended to an island on the planet near the binary they had identified as most likely to harbor life, the first rays of morning sun shone through a break in the clouds. Dropping closer, they could see isolated copses of trees, occasional orchards, and well-kept farms. Immediately below them on the southeastern shore of the island was a silvery beach, and beyond it a stretch of lawn and an occasional house. "At least," said Bliss, and there was that in her voice that was not entirely approving, "the climate is evidently equable. I would even say warm." Indeed, a human was watching the ship descend. Her hair was black, long and glossy. Her skin color was a pale brown, her eyes were narrow, and though she wore a wraparound skirt, she wore nothing at all above her waist, which accounted for Bliss's estimate of the climate. "I'll go out and talk to the woman, if she speaks anything comprehensible," Trevize said. "The rest of you—" "I should think," said Bliss firmly, "that we might as well all step out. That woman looks completely harmless, and in any case, I want to stretch my legs and breathe planetary air, and perhaps arrange for planetary food. I want Fallum to get the feel of a world again, too." When they had all made their way down the ramp from the ship, the young woman said to Trevize, who had taken the lead, "I greet thee, and I greet thy companions." Pellerat said joyfully, "Oh, wonderful! She speaks classical galactic, and with a correct accent." "I understand her, too, more or less." Trevize smiled at the woman. "We come from across space. We come from another world." "That is well," she said. "Comes thy ship from the Empire?" "It comes from a far star, and the ship is named Far Star. My name is Golan Trevize. My friend is Janov Pellerat. The woman is Bliss, and the child is Fallum." "I am Hiroko." "And where are the others?" asked Trevize. "You seem to be the only one here to greet us." Hiroko said, "Many men are aboard the fish boats. Many women are in the fields. I take holiday these last 2 days, and so am fortunate enough to see this great thing. Yet people are curious, and the ship will have been seen as it descended. Others will be here soon." "And what do you call your world?" asked Trevize. "It is Alpha, good sir. We are taught that the whole name is Alpha Centauri, if that has more meaning to thee. But we call it Alpha only. It is a fair-visaged world." "Your world is beautiful. And what might be the name of this island on which you and your people live?" said Trevize, finding himself trapped in the ornate sound of classical galactic, and wondering desperately if he had the conjugations right. Hiroko said, "We call our heavenly island New Earth," at which Trevize and Pellerat stared at each other with surprise and delight. There was no time to follow up on the statement. Others were arriving, dozens, mostly women and children and a few elderly men. They came on foot for the most part, though there were also 2 ground cars in evidence, rather old and clumsy. Even if they did control the weather, this was clearly a low-technology society, Trevize thought. Fallum took a sudden deep breath and buried her head in Bliss's arm. As few as the newcomers were, to Fallum they were a mob. Bliss said suddenly, "Miss Hiroko, my youngster is not accustomed to travel through space, and she is absorbing more novelty than she can easily manage. Would it be possible for her to sit down and perhaps have something to eat and drink?" Hiroko's hand flew to her mouth. "I crave your pardon, respected madam. I had not thought of this child's needs nor of thine. Would you all, as visitors and guests, enter the refectory for morning meal? May we join you and serve as hosts?" Bliss said, "That is kind of you. It would be better, though, if you alone served as hostess, for the sake of the comfort of the child, who is unaccustomed to so many people." Hiroko rose to her feet. "It shall be as thou hast said." She led them then in leisurely manner across the grass to a large dining room where, clearly, the Alphans usually ate community fashion. Eventually a young woman served them eggs and broiled fish and small roasted potatoes, all of which the spacefarers ate heartily. It was not long before Trevize said, "You call this island New Earth, Hiroko. Where then might Old Earth be?" She looked at him in bewilderment. "Old Earth, say you? I crave pardon, respected sir. I take not thy meaning." Trevize said, "Before there was a new Earth, your people must have lived somewhere. Where was it they came from?" "I know naught of that, respected sir," she said with troubled gravity. "This land has been mine all of my life, and my mother's and my grandmother's before me." Trevize frowned, and Pellerat bent toward him and whispered in her defense, "She is very young, Golan. You can scarcely expect her to be a great repository of information." Trevize thought about that. Then he said, "Now I shall tell you why we are here, Miss Hiroko. My friend, Dr. Pellerat, is a scholar on our world. He studies myths and legends, old tales, if you will. Are there learned ones on New Earth who know the old tales of this world?" Hiroko's forehead creased. "This is not a manner in which I am myself skilled. But we do have an old man in these parts who loves to prate of ancient days. Manoli, he calls himself." "Would you lead my friend to Manoli?" Trevize asked. "That may anyone do at any time," she answered. "The ancient is ever home, and being but a man, he is ever ready to greet an ear." Trevize said, "And perhaps an older woman would be willing to come and sit with Madame Bliss. She has the child to care for and cannot move about too much. It would please her to have company, for women, as you know, are fond of—" "Prating?" Hiroko was clearly amused. "Why, so men say, although I have always observed that men are always the greater babblers. Let the men return from their fishing, and one will vie with another in great flights of fancy concerning their catches. Wilt thou pardon my absence a moment?"